Our final plenary is related to the intended fruit of all the work represented by this international community, movements to Christ. Please welcome Martin and Daniel Hoskins with Motus Dei. Would you please introduce yourselves and share more about your work and Motus Dei?
Okay, thank you, Dan. It's Andy Martin here, going first. Thank you, everyone, for having us. This is a great opportunity for us to connect more widely. My job is for the first few minutes to try and give you an introduction to what Motus Dei is, what it's including, and then Daniel Hoskins will go into greater detail about our research. Because primarily what we're hoping for this afternoon and the purpose in us being invited to take part in this conference is how can there be greater partnership for greater research on what is happening with disciple-making movements, church-planting movements, etc. As you'll hear in our presentations, there are many terms for this phenomenon. But as I said, my job is just to give an intro. Daniel will then go deeper. We hope that we'll leave enough time for questions and some discussion. Because it's helpful in terms of understanding what Motus Dei is and the breadth of who's involved. My background is I'm a pastor. I'm from the UK, but for many, many years now, over 20 years, I've been helping start new churches across the Middle East and Central Asia, or partnering with indigenous churches in this region. And therefore, the interest in the phenomenon of movements, I started to come across that personally through our work and what was happening on the ground, people we were meeting many, many years ago, and started asking questions about what was really going on. And eventually this led me to connecting with others who've then formed the Motus Dei network. Motus Dei is Latin for the movement of God. We felt this would be a good name for capturing a research group that is looking to see what God is doing through movements. We established a network to help foster and coordinate scholarly research on global discipleship movements with the purpose of promoting quality missiology to create better understanding across all kinds of different groups that are involved with this kind of work, but also effective mission practices for the global church among the nations. Can good research leads to better understanding of what's happening on the ground and therefore leads to greater fruitfulness in all kinds of contexts. That's the purpose. Not only the statistics, not only the understanding of the phenomenon, but can this then help many, many others, people on this screen, other practitioners, then implement some of what's being learnt for greater harvest. Although they are not a new phenomenon in terms of movements, you could trace going back a few decades, actually, in terms of the history of movements, and certainly, depending on your definition of movements, right the way back into history, and certainly into the New Testament. In terms of what we're talking about primarily today, during the last decade, movements, like I said, many different titles: discipleship-making movements, church-planting movements, people movements. Daniel will touch on this a little bit more in a minute. They have come right to the fore in the world mission conversation during the last decade. For example, in 2017, one of the groups that researches and tries to track movements around the world counted 600 movements. 5 years later, in this year, they're tracking 1,850 movements. So a huge increase. These movements vary in size, from having over a few thousand disciples to some having over 1 million disciples. Movement leaders, movement catalysts, another term for those who help start movements, are working very, very hard at accurate numbers. Presentation yesterday from Finishing the Task illustrated some of what's being used. So there's a chart that was shown with different streams and counting. Movement leaders are working in that way. We mentioned Justin Long in another presentation today. He and his team are working really hard to try and get accurate numbers. But primarily what's important is that movement leaders all agree that what they are seeing is a work of God. Certain methodologies are a contributing factor. For example, discipling groups of people within their existing contexts and social relationships. We heard earlier today about how we're living in the social network age. And that's playing a huge contribution in terms of how movements are working. Can we learn more about that? What's happening in different places? What kind of networks? The foundation of engagement with the Word of God that expects disciples to put what they're learning into practice, and in so doing, experience God transform their lives. The idea of developing leaders right from the start, Indigenous leaders, empowering them. So right at the beginning, you're seeing the gospel go from Indigenous person to Indigenous person. These will be some of the methodologies. There's others, but that will be common in different movements. But primarily, this is a move of God. Every movement leader who tells their story will tell you of the centrality of prayer and widespread gospel communication to many people. The purpose of Motus Day, then, could be summarized as wanting to answer the question, what is really going on the ground in the specific context of where movements are happening? What's happening behind the numbers? What are some of the social factors, the cultural factors, the leadership factors, the individual factors of what is happening? Can we research this and get a better grasp of the story? Not unlike what George said, a slightly different application, but George saying ground truthing. So beyond the numbers, beyond some of the methodology, what are some of the other ground truthing factors that are happening? That's the purpose of Motus Day. Also, can we learn what hinders movements and prevents multiplication? In this conversation, we have movement catalysts, we have researchers, we have leaders, we have practitioners, we have theologians and academics. They're all part of Motus Day Network. Currently, over 150 people are involved, men and women from the global north and the global south. I've tried to give you a brief overview, but Dr. Daniel Hoskins will now take us deeper into some of the research questions, because that's our prime focus today. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. It's good to be with you today. It's a privilege to help represent the Motus Day Network here at this gathering. As for my own background, my family and I were 12 years as church planners in Central Asia, which is where I learned mission ethnography. Eventually, we were kicked out of the country we worked in 2009, and since then I've been doing mission research full-time for a variety of networks and organizations. Right now, my two primary jobs are as the Director of Fruitful Practice Research, which is part of the Vision 5-9 network, and I'm a qualitative researcher for the Bethany Research Institute in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, with a group like this, it's hard to know how wide, how deep, exactly how to go in a conversation when we're talking about this, and I don't want to repeat too much of what Andy said, so forgive me if I cover familiar ground, but a fundamental part of the discussion we're having has to be, what do we call a movement? Well, rather than a definition, I think I'd like to look back at Donald McGavran and Ralph Winter, who were some of the first advocates, if not the first advocates for this kind of thinking, and look at how they didn't think so much about formal definitions as they did on identifying key concepts. I think that's critical for what we're talking about. I don't have time to go in deeply into the writings, but I think we can distill what they said into two core issues. And number one, movements are made up of people coming to Christ and staying within what they call their social sphere of their own people. They're not extracted out to join the existing church in one way or another. In other words, the new believers remain at one with their own kinfolk in clothing, marriage, eating patterns. They eat the same food as their people eat. If their people are vegetarians, they don't change and say, well, now that I'm Christian, I eat meat. Therefore, indigenous movements offer the lost an opportunity to join a worshiping community of their own people without embracing Western theology, traditions, culture, or individualism. However, we need to point out that that's not saying that they continue to remain with their people in issues such as idolatry, sinfulness, drunkenness, whatever else is a habit of their people. Movements have to be living demonstrations of what their people might look like and can look like as a redeemed people of God. And that leads us now to the second core idea that we find in movements and that Motus Day really functions around. And that is, in a movement, the harvesters are in the harvest. In other words, the engine of evangelism and multiplication in a movement are the local believers themselves reaching their own people. The foreign expatriate missionary is not the prime driver. As far as the local community is concerned, the local church is by far the most visible representation of the church in a movement. Andy mentioned the term a lot of people use in the movement world. They use the term catalyst to refer to a pioneer missionary. And I like the way Webster's dictionary helps define catalyst, because it helps give a sense of what that means in a pioneer mission environment, and that a catalyst is an agent that provokes or speeds significant change or action. Well, then in 1997, I believe it was, David Garrison offered a concise definition of a church planting movement, which is obviously one kind of movement, as a rapid and exponential increase of indigenous churches, planting indigenous churches within a given people group or population segment. Later he quantified this by including with it at least 1,000 baptisms or 100 churches. Other definitions have been developed in the years since. A prominent one is used by the 2414 Coalition, who define a movement as a multiplication of disciples making disciples and leaders making leaders, resulting in indigenous churches, usually house churches, planting more churches. Others, like Emmanuel Prince, have tightened this up and given it a quantitative parameter, saying that multiplication needs to extend out to the fourth generation of multiplying churches. Now, these other definitions are helpful, but I want to make an important point that in Modus Dei, that is not what we get bogged down at. Modus Dei is a wide group, thus there's a natural range of opinions when you start digging into that level of detail. Some members of Modus Dei, the Modus Dei network, think in terms of church planting movements, others in disciple-making movements. Still others are working with insider movements. And each one of these ways of thinking about movements bring their own definitions to the table. And that brings up something Andy's already mentioned, is that Modus Dei is not about training. It's not about field practice per se. What it's about is those are the outcomes we're hoping to influence through Modus Dei. The Modus Dei network is all about research into movements. That's reflected in the first product of our network, a book that I think is appropriately titled Modus Dei, the Movement of God to Disciple the Nations. Let me share my screen so you can just see that real quick in case you haven't. If I can find it here. Yeah, let's try this. You have to forgive me. Well, there we go. There we go, I think. Can everyone see my screen? There's a Modus Dei book.
See a blank white screen?
Oh.
Yeah, a map of India.
Map of India. You don't see that screen right there. Okay. You try one more time. Stop screen share. Try it one more time and see if I can get this to work. How about that? Okay. Can you see it now?
Something's coming. Yes.
Good. So the Modus Dei book, let me see if I can get my notes back up here. And at the same time, I'm trying to look at this. Nope, you know what? This isn't going to work. So let me stop the screen share. Sorry, I don't want to be distracting. The Modus Dei book is a deep dive into various aspects of movement thinking. It contains 22 chapters. They're organized into 5 major sections. They were written by researchers and practitioners from all around the world. It's a very practical example of what Modus Dei is about, and that's collaborative approach to knowledge generation. That's what we want to see, is collaboration that generates new knowledge and understanding of the phenomena of movements. In the Modus Dei network, we believe that better research equals better understanding, which equals better field practice. Our role in that is to do better research. That we want to produce and get out there as a collaborative group that increases and gives better understanding that then will translate into better field practice. And by better, we mean research that is not only robust, but also multidisciplinary. We believe that good missiological research must include many different fields like theology, sociology, cultural anthropology, history, statistical analysis, leadership theory, and others. These are the many different lenses that need to be brought to bear on various questions that are raised by the phenomena of movements to Christ. Many of you already know Warwick Farah, it was his brainchild to start the Modus Dei network. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today, but I do want to briefly draw from an article he wrote last year for the Great Commission Research Journal. And I think Andy's going to put the link up to that in the chat box. In that article, Warwick outlined 6 key areas of research that he found were of interest to the participants in the Modus Dei network. He did a survey of those who participated in our online gathering, and he came up with 6 main areas. And these are deep topics. We don't have the time to go into them, but I do want to open up. I do want to list each topic, and rather than explain them, I just want to voice some of the questions that they raise, because really that's what we're about as researchers, is asking good questions and then going after them. So the first area he found was, and I believe these are in the order of importance that they were given by the participants in that survey. First one is deeper theological and missiological descriptions of movements. Deeper theological and missiological descriptions of movements. Questions like, what are the biblical foundations to a movement approach to mission? What theological presuppositions are movements grounded in? Are there hybrids between movements and the traditional model that exist? Second area of research he identified that among the group was, what are the best practices for effective movement strategies? Questions like, what should a catalyst be doing in the early stages of a movement? What are the key obstacles to a movement developing, and how would you overcome them? Or even, how do you sustain a movement after an initial burst of growth? The third area was the ecclesiology of movements. What kinds of churches are being produced by movements? Or what are the challenges these movement churches face as they attempt to remain faithful to historic Christian orthodoxy, yet pour new wine into new wineskins? Number fourth area, the training of movement catalysts and practitioners. What kind of training is effective to develop a movement catalyst? What does good coaching look like in the context of a rapidly multiplying movement? How can the Western university approach to education be used to serve movements? Number 5, the contextual, sociological, and holistic features of movements. Questions like, how does social network theory help us understand the growth of movements? How does a people group's history impact their movement developing among them? Or how does the religious context change the nature of a Christward movement among that people group? And finally, area number 6 is the whole issue of documenting movements and the verifications and metrics of their growth. Questions that need to be answered, like how to build the trust needed for verification efforts. How do movements financially sustain themselves? And another one would be, what are the best practices for movements when they're reporting the growth that they're seeing? Now, these are just a few of the topics, a small sampling of the kinds of questions that need to be explored if we're going to really understand movements to Christ that are happening in our generation. And this is where Modus Day's focus on collaboration comes in. As a network of researchers and practitioners, we want to encourage not just research, and not even just good research, but robust collaborative research. We believe that when the body of Christ collaborates, like we're doing here, like this, what this meeting is about, when we collaborate well, not only do we benefit, but the body of Christ gains richer insights because different lenses are brought to focus on that research task through the collaboration. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Andy, and we're going to try to do some question and answer now.
Daniel, thank you. I hope our presentation has given you an overview. Obviously, some of it's at the high level. We've tried to give a flavor of some of the research which has happened and then potential areas for future research. But interaction now, questions or things you'd find helpful for us to say a bit more on, comments about how collaboration could work, where there are overlaps with work that some of you are already doing, and how should we partner together more. We want the focus to be primarily on research rather than kind of questions about the analysis of movements and what's really happening. I've put the website in the chat, and you can reach us that way in terms of if there's other discussions that you want to have. But primarily, how can collaboration happen between what this group represents and what Motus Day is doing to promote greater understanding of movement? So over to you. Put your hand up, or as the graphic, or literally give us a wave, and we'll see what we can do to help answer.
And just a reminder that the raising your hand is found behind the reactions part of your Zoom controls.
Thanks, Dwayne.
I see Stephanie Kraft has written a question into the chat. Stephanie, do you want to voice that or shall I read it for you? Go ahead.
Daniel, thank you. And also, Andy, thank you so much. I'm so grateful that there's serious research going on movements, because I do believe with you that this is a move of God. I recognize also that you're subject to criticisms, mostly from the academy, but from elsewhere. What are the criticisms that are being levied at movements that you think are the most justified?
Andy, you want me to take that one?
Yeah, please.
One of them that I think is that really has to be wrestled with is the lack of transparency in a lot of movements. And believe me, I understand the security issues involved. There's a lot of really complex issues, but somehow we've got to do a better job of reducing that opaqueness and bringing more transparency to how movements are reporting their data, where the data is coming from, and those kinds of things. And I think that's a critical issue. Another one that I think better research can address are the missiological foundations of movements. A lot of people have only heard very superficial talk about where movements come from in the Bible. And I think movement practitioners need to develop and write more robust theological basis for what they're doing.
And one more comment from me. Many movement leaders, catalysts are now doing very good work, not just the numbers and documenting them, but actually qualitative research in terms of the discipleship and the maturity which is coming. So some of these movements are really maturing now. And I think getting that more known would answer a lot of people's questions. Certainly some of the questions I was asking, because you get your head around the numbers and think, well, of course God can do this. And then you begin to understand that actually some of these movements now have been going for years, and the questions that the movement leaders are asking are the same questions that some of us are asking. What kind of maturity is being produced? And there's some really good work from some of these movement leaders. And I think making that more known, part of the transparency that Daniel's talking about, if there are ways of making that known, that would really help people understand more about the quality of what God is doing. Good question.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Emmanuel, I see a question in the chat. Are you able to voice that or shall I read that?
Oh, you can read it for me, please.
Very good. Emmanuel Coifo says, there seems to be a huge gap between research and what it gives and the use of these findings by the local church members. I see evangelization would achieve its purpose if the whole community of believers would come on board. How do we bridge the gap?
Well, I'll take a stab at that one. As it relates to movements, I think one thing that helps but needs to be done a lot more of is I think the movement practitioner community needs to produce good case studies that demonstrate how things are happening. What does it look like as a movement is evolving or beginning or whatever, so that people can see. I was talking to a young man recently who started a movement in his country. He's a Muslim background believer himself, and he was talking about how critical it was that he heard case studies of how something like that happened in a country like his own, among a people similar to his. He said it just allowed him to imagine what it might look like in his people and his tribe. And I think that's one thing that I hope we see in the next few years is more case studies being developed, good, solid, well-grounded case studies, so people see what movement generation looks like.
Mm-hmm. Great. Other questions? Raise your hand digitally or type something in.
It's a big group, but don't be shy. Ah, thank you, Stephanie. Didn't know that.
Danny, I see you have raised your hand. You're a great contributor. Go for it.
Thank you. I have sensed that there's a lag in getting the information about how many people are involved in movements into people group information listed in databases. Is that true? What are the ways that that data is reported to these larger databases, or is it just sensitivity that is keeping that, from happening? And how can that data sharing be improved in the future?
Well, one of the key issues when you start getting to that level of data is you've got to have trusted brokers communicating across these networks, and that's something that is still an evolving concept. Is having trusted nodes, people that know each other well enough that they know they can share data in an environment that they know it's only going to go as far as it should go with the level of granularity that it should go in. Part of the difficulty, I think, is in my experience, limited on ground experience, is that sometimes movement leaders don't understand how going to that much risk and that much work is going to benefit. They don't understand the benefit of it, and so there's kind of like a cost benefit analysis that they're not sure how much effort they want to put into revealing that kind of data, because they see it maybe too costly for what benefit it's going to produce. And so there's some of that that's got to be overcome, I think.
Great. One final question here. In the chat, George Guma has asked, what key difference exists in movements in different continents, and what might account for those differences?
Mm-hmm. It's a very good question. It's one that really ought to be addressed systematically and through solid research, but I'll just give you my personal observation is that one of the key differences is going to be the structure, individualism, hierarchical nature, communal nature of the different communities that you see in different parts of the world, where those emphasis are, and therefore the structure of the movements has a lot to do. I've seen some movements that are very hierarchical, but they're from societies that are very hierarchical. Seen others that are much more egalitarian, and then again, they're in societies that are egalitarian. The movements, a true movement is going to reflect the nature of the society it's in, and so those social structures are going to make a big difference in what movements look like and how they spread.
Right. Great questions. We are running out of time for this. Thank you so much, brothers from Motus Day, for introducing us to all of that and the deep issues you are grappling with. Excellent.